Yeah, one of the rules of speaking to people is you must make sure you know what you're talking about. So I had to go and do a little bit of homework about prickly pear. Of course, um, it is sometimes a bit of a tuksvy if we think of our Afrikaans seafood. Um, but it is part of our lives in the Karoo, and it's been part of our lives, all of us here, um, because it's been present and we use them, we hate them, we love them, we do all kinds of things with them. It's a useful plant. Okay, so the plant itself, the prickly pear or puntia, um, is a cactus. Very important. It's a proper cactus. Okay, and cactus only occur in South and Central America. Okay, there are even 300-400 species of cactus. Some very useful ones, some horrible, horrible ones. Cactus are endemic to that area, but they escaped, like a lot of plants. Okay. Um, interesting. One of the things that I found out is that there's one cactus in Africa which is classified as indigenous, and it's in East Africa. Sorry, in West Africa, and it's actually a parasitic cactus. In other words, it's like a voorland or a mistletoe. It grows on other plants, and it's got a sticky fruit. And they think that it escaped America on a bird, blown across from Central or South America somewhere where it occurs naturally, all the way to Africa, because it was in Africa when people started writing these things. So it wasn't brought there by people, most likely. But who knows? Maybe it fell onto a coconut and went around the world twice before it washed up on a beach in West Africa. Um, so it's not entirely true to say that there are no cactuses anywhere other than in South and Central America. Um, but every single cactus you see in Graaff-Reinet or the Karoo or anywhere, they are all introduced species. Now the question always remains, why were they introduced? Okay. And the very obvious answer is people liked them. People used them, people carried them around with them. It might have been for food, it might have been for fodder, it might have been for flowers, it might have been for presents, or anything you can actually imagine. But people carried them around with them. Apparently, they were already in Australia in 1790, and they were taken to Australia on purpose by the colonizing uh, authority to be used to farm cochineal to dye the British soldiers' redcoats with. I mean, it's incredible to think that they took prickly pears all the way to Australia. And by the early 1800s, they were a massive, massive problem because they had spread and spread and spread. No one, in my opinion, can precisely identify when they arrived in South Africa, but it was a very long time ago. Okay, so just a little bit on the actual physical plant, and then we've got a wonderful book called Prickly Pear. It's a social history of the plant in the Eastern Cape by William Barnard and Luvuyo Watsela. And I'm going to just go through the book a little bit because it's a wonderful book. If anyone's interested in plants or history, it's an absolute must. It's actually Julian's book, so I'm borrowing it. He's the book man. But if we just have a look at the prickly pears that we have here in Graaff-Reinet, the most common garden one, the Kaalblad. Okay, I think there's even one down just around the corner here. Okay, and the Kaalblad is definitely planted for human food. Okay, and there are numerous varieties of it with different color fruit, and it's farmed all over the world. The prickly pear commercial production industry in Europe is massive. It's absolutely massive. You can't believe it. They've got pack houses like their pack houses down in Addo, Kirkwood. They've got pack houses like that just do prickly pears. I also brought this one because there's some cochineal. Now, we spoke about cochineal being taken all the way to Australia to be made into uniform dye. But the point is, it's a little insect, okay, with a white um, covering, waxy covering. There I've popped the insect, and there the cochineal dies. So you can actually farm insects for cochineal, for food coloring, and for dyes. Synthetic dyes are much more effective, stable, and cheaper than these dyes. So the only reason why you might farm cochineal now would be for food purposes for humans who want natural products or something like that. Okay. And there's obviously a flower. This is the normal flowering coal blot prickly pear. And there's an out of season fruit. Okay. We we all know that they look like this, but I just found one on my prickly pears in my garden. Unfortunately, the birds ate a hole into it, and so the was in there, no good as a fruit. But that's obviously the fruit that we are after as humans. Then the other coal blot that we commonly get in Graftonate is the red one. Okay, there's the red one. Jacaranda is not meant to be on it. It's also just relatively coal blot. It's not entirely coal blot. But that's the red prickly pear. There are huge plantations of them basically from Graftonate up into the Snuba. Kevin Watermeyer has got a magnificent plantation up at Sierplas. And in fact, Kevin assures me that he can put 100 cattle in there for 2 months, and they don't even need water. That's how useful that plantation is. The thing about it from a farming point of view is that the coal blot is very valuable as fodder, especially in a drought. And the animals don't naturally eat it, but when they push to it or if you feed it, you can. Then obviously the other side of the prickly pear is a doringblad, okay? And that's what a doringblad looks like. And I mean, there are some that are even more doringerig. I mean, properly doringblad. And so you really don't want to play with this one. It's dangerous to humans, to animals, everything. And those thorns are terrible. Now, interestingly enough, the thorn is actually the modified leaf of the plant. And the cladode or blot is actually the stem of the plant. Okay? So these little guys that are so sharp and horrible, they are actually modified leaves, which become the thorn. Okay. And then I also brought along a ornamental one, which I don't exactly know who or why they would have brought, anyone would have brought this thing in. I suppose it's got a pretty flower. And these aren't, you can't really eat them. I mean, I suppose you really could if you had to, but you certainly wouldn't grow them for eating. And there are hundreds of them all along the power lines. Blake Ridge, particularly badly infested with them. I've spoken to Harry and he told me that the boss is going to do something about it soon. I saw the boss on Friday at the club and he said, no, he knows nothing about the instruction. So but I know Uncle Norman had a big battle with them at Watervlei, but there are biological control agents for them. Okay. But it's almost like sort of crazy that people even allow them to grow. And the problem is that if a cladode falls down onto the ground, that's what happens. It just makes roots and grows. Okay. So wherever you put it, what you can see here is there was a cladode that fell on the ground. It dried out, so it did that. And in doing that, it got good contact with the soil, and that's where the roots went in. Okay. And I knew there was one in Roodblom, and I went early this morning, and I managed to find it because I'd sort of had some idea that we might have sprayed it, but we obviously haven't sprayed it. And it's in full flower, tons of flowers, and I've got to go and spray it when I get home again. Okay, so what I've also got here is this is the coal blot flower, pretty flowers, eh? Yeah, and then, I mean, they're just full of, well, they were this morning, full of thrips, okay? So now I know where all the thrips come from in my onions. Because the thrips fly and they get blown by the wind, and I spray them and then they're there the next day. Okay, and then just while we, I noticed that I brought this one specifically because it looks like it's infected by not cochineal, but Cactoblastis. And this one definitely is infected by Cactoblastis. And you can see the Cactoblastis lesion where they've been eating the plant. And then that's their waste product coming out there. And if we cut this open, we might even find little Cactoblastis worms. And and they're very pretty little worms, and I don't know if they will be in here, but let's just see. But what is interesting about this is that a lot of these plants, when they arrive, foreign plants arrive in other clans, they are without enemies. Because, look, I don't see a mature one, but there are obviously little ones because it's busy rotting in the middle. But what happens is that the plants often arrive on another continent without any hojos, because the hojos don't naturally occur here. So the biggest problem that Australia had and South Africa was complete invasion of farmland. South Africa, we'll talk about it in here, but just for interest's sake, Australia, a piece of land bigger than Britain, was unusable because of prickly pear. And you couldn't actually believe that there was so much. Some of it was 15, 20 foot tall. And they had to do something very urgently. And they introduced a number of indigenous pests from Australia. It's a much more complicated process than I thought. I thought you just go and catch some hojos there, bring them, throw them in, and off they go. But they've got to make dead certain they're not going to eat something else that's particularly valuable. And you're not introducing a lot of other problems. So there's a proper scientific process. It takes a long time. And for instance, they've got to make sure that the hojo they bring doesn't bring its predator as well. Otherwise, you're just creating a whole cycle of that here as well. So it's quite a big, fascinating process. All right, so before we get to the uses of prickly pear and things like that, I just want to present this book. Essentially, this is a book about the prickly pear in South Africa. And it's most common one is Opuntia ficus indica. Okay, now it's called Opuntia ficus indica. Opuntia being the plant, ficus being fig, obviously. People thought it was a kind of a fig. And indica was because they thought it was from India. But not the India on that side, the American India. So it's a little bit confusing because when I saw it was indica, I thought, oh, well, I wonder how the hell they got to India. But it's not. It's the American Indian, the red Indian. In Afrikaans, of course, we call it Turksvy. Okay, so how Turkey got involved in it, no one seems to really know. But they do discuss some of those things in this book. Okay, the physical and biological characteristics are typical of cacti. They thrive at 250 mils of rainfall and up. So we are almost on the edge. And just interesting enough today, just driving in the veld, I noticed that on Roy Blom, every 500 meters, if you look carefully, there will be a prickly pear. But a lot of them are small. A lot of them are fruit, busy dying of disease, which we've introduced. And so it's not as if there's a problem with them. And so the question remains, are they a useful plant or are they an invader, an alien and unuseful, dangerous invader? And we could spend hours talking about it. But what is important is that there's still communities in South Africa that earn very important for them amounts of money from the prickly pear in Tolofeer season. In Xhosa, it's called a Tolofeer. And as soon as you start driving near Uitenhage, Grahamstown, from about mid-January, I think it's about mid-January, then there'll be people selling prickly pear on the side of the road. These guys did a study of that business and discovered that it creates a huge cash injection into very poor communities that desperately need the money. Okay. The biggest problem with that is that when we were invaded with prickly pear, can anyone remember prickly pear invasion of Graaff-Reinet? I don't think anyone's old enough to remember that. Okay. And I remember always asking my opa about it. And my opa always said we had to cut paths into the prickly pear so that the stock could come out the mountain to drink water, you know. And then there are photographs of Tuintjiesberg with an old motor car that belonged to one of the McNaughtons, and then during the prickly pear, and then after the prickly pear. And there are wonderful stories about um, donkeys who got lost in the prickly pear, and no one ever saw the donkeys and they bred and they became like herds of wild donkeys in the prickly pear because no one knew they were there. They just lived in the prickly pear. But I've got some photographs on Rooiblom up the kloof, and then of course in town, William Rowe's photographs. I know Johan, you've got a lot of them. Where's Johan? There. Oh, there. You've got a lot of those William Rowe photographs of the Rowe line, and there's a lot of prickly pear still then. But that was they were busy eradicating already, and so the prickly pear was busy disappearing. And there's one photograph, particularly on Rooiblom, of Aunt Marge shearing and Uncle Jim on horses in the kloof, and there's a lot of prickly pear in the background. But nothing quite like my opa explained or claimed there to be, you know. But that would have been when Aunt Marge was in her 20s, and so they probably had been eradicating them. Some of the eradication was physical. They would pack stones in like a block, like this, cut the prickly pear, put it on the stones, because if you put it on the ground, it starts growing. So you had to put it on stones to keep it from making contact with the soil, let it dry out, pack doringbome or whatever onto it, light them and burn them. And when we hunt in Bedford, Grahamstown, Bedford area, you find lots of these stone packs, and we didn't know what they were, you know. And we thought maybe they must have been houses or crawls or people collecting stones for some reason, you know, or graves even. And then one day we worked out it's where they packed the prickly pear to stop them from rooting while they were chopping them out physically. So the question is it a bio-invasion, or is it a valuable plant? Okay, so the problem then again comes to people use the prickly pear fruit for all kinds of things. There was even a prickly pear festival in Utenhage, which has come to an end, unfortunately. You know, when I read about the festival, I was quite sad that they've sort of stopped it, and I hope one day they maybe get it going again. And the ladies from the churches used to make prickly pear this and prickly pear that and prickly pear. So it was mostly, obviously, jams, cordials, syrups, jellies, tamalekis, and I mean anything you can really imagine. But the one that tickled me, which doesn't seem to have happened in Mexico, is the ladies in Utenhage used to take the peel of the actual fruit, this peel, yeah, and they would slice off the thin outside layer and then cut it into, let's say it's like inch long, half-inch wide blocks, soak that in sugar and then dry it, and they called them titsvee dadels because they apparently looked like dates that had been pitted, and they tasted a bit like dates. So they even made fake dates out of prickly pears. So not only was there, let's call it an indigenous poor people industry, which still is very, very big, but there was also, let's call it a farm fair kind of industry of ladies making prickly pear. And then, of course, the other very interesting product is alcohol. Anything with sugar in that can ferment can produce alcohol. And there were inevitably breweries that specialized in prickly pear liquor. I don't think much of it has ever been distilled. I'm sure there have been, but I mean, that's not how they consume it. They normally consume it as a beer or a wine, okay, fresh wine or beer. And it seems like what you did is you went and harvested a lot of prickly pears, sold them until they were too pop to be sold as fresh anymore. Then you would peel them, mash them, put in some curry yeast, which was a wild yeast that they would find in the veld. Roots of a specific Nasanda breathum. I can't remember the plant's name, but it's one of the faithies. And obviously put a lot of sugar in because that's where most of the alcohol will come from. And there were proper shebeens that specialized in in alcohol production. Reading a little bit about those shebeens is interesting because sometimes the police turned a blind eye to them because they were actually so part of the community, where literally households depended on making money out of brewing beer. One of the people quoted in here is the Danquist family at Klu near Port Beaufort, where they said basically during prickly pear season on a Monday they couldn't work. That was it. Quite something. Anyway, that's quoted here in the book. And there's a lot of information about the brewing and how many people it takes to brew one vat, and how much it would be worth, and the mula, which is the yeast, and how they find it, and pictures of people drinking it, the policing, costs and profits, how they picked it, and then, all right, the prickly pear seems like it was in the Cape in the 1770s. So, I mean, it's just amazing to think that it's been here that long. And the problem was that every person who trekked would take his best prickly pear with him. Now, just thinking of that, we had the farm Alton in Murraysburg, and I remember the Alton prickly pears were the best prickly pears. They were always the biggest, and they were always the sweetest. And I don't know how many times we brought Alton prickly pear cladodes or blyer and planted them on rooibloem, but they got annihilated by the cochineal and cattoblastus. And I know that William Biggs at Flayplaas has got that prickly pear. And I think I've brought about 20 leaves in my time on rooibloem, and they get eaten. So they're obviously very susceptible to them, because Gerard de Kock at Grootfontein, he put a very big effort in classifying, quantifying, and measuring the prickly pears, and crossbreeding. And he actually bred the de Kock variety, which was sort of punted as being the best one to plant for livestock fodder from Middelburg, Richmond, that area up there. Did you guys have a big plantation? And did you find it useful, John?
In fact, the Red's grandfather, Opa, was very much involved bringing all those in.
Yeah.
By train in the Oxford.
Yeah.
It became too easy with new technology to feed animals, and
that's
so
right.
We're not interested in it.
Not
so
anymore.
now
Yeah.
You put the cattle in, you destroy them.
Yeah. But you don't have the cochineal and cattoblastus problems. I think it's too cold. Yeah. And then the other interesting thing is they don't do well in the warmer, wetter areas. That's why there's still prickly pear in Uitenhage, Yankee, Potensi, and then down the coast, all the way to Port Alfred and Co. Okay, so it's a very, very interesting book because it's got all kinds of things. But one of the biggest vectors of movement is obviously crows and baboons. And the fruit is irresistible in prickly pear season to monkeys, baboons, and crows and other birds. But like for instance at Blake Ridge, all those ones growing on underneath the pie line, that's where the crows sleep. So they go and eat prickly pears, and then at night they deposit the seed all down the pie line. So next time you drive on it, and there's a telephone line or a pie line that the crows use, have a look. You'll just see prickly pear after prickly pear all the way down that line, because they're one of the biggest spreaders. Obviously, warthogs apparently are big spreaders of the seed at the moment. And it's just interesting that neither warthogs nor prickly pears are meant to be in Grahamstown. Yeah. Ostrich, the ostrich industry. People fed their birds chopped prickly pear, and that was also another reason for planting prickly pear orchards. The Doringblad and the Kaalblad, they are here. Now, quite a few Graafrenet farmers are mentioned in the book, including Auntie Anne's grandfather, my great-grandfather, and Sidney Ribbage. He's mentioned as being a a very interested person in prickly pear, very pro prickly pear. Okay, and there were people that were pro prickly pear, and there were people that were anti prickly pear. And I'm just trying to work out where um, yeah, okay, yeah. An experiment in 1930. This is a documented experiment done by scientists at Grootfontein on the commonage. Um, sheep were kept alive on prickly pear, bone meal, and salt. They did become emaciated, but recovered quickly when put onto a normal diet. But on Wellwood, in one of the very bad droughts in the early 1900s, an entire merino ewe flock was fed prickly pear only, no water, because there wasn't any water, and they survived the drought in an emaciated condition, but they managed to get them through. And that is a documented scientific paper lodged at Grootfontein. So you can imagine how Sidney Rubidge would have felt about prickly pear, maybe a bit different to somebody else. Um, yeah, he says, yeah, Rubidge began large-scale plantations in 1927. He lost a few hundred sheep from drought despite having established 20,000 spineless cactus plants on Wellwood. He calculated on the basis of the sheep average consumption of one sheep, consumption by one sheep per day, he needed 146,000 plants for 2,000 sheep. Yeah, so the farmers at the time um, um, did do scientific calculations and kept rainfall records and grazing strategies um, and were very happy with prickly pear. However, there was always the counter argument, and my great grandfather Tom was very unhappy with prickly pear. Most likely because he couldn't get them to grow on Revlon because of the Cractoblastus and the cochineal. And yeah, there were various. Okay, now another one. One of the other horrible prickly pears is the Leukes cactus or jointed cactus or kaiki, and it's called kaiki because it claws onto you like a cat. And I promise you, if there any come to Roy Blom, I'm leaving. I don't want anything to do with those things. I've never seen such a horrible plant in my life. You see cattle walking around there in Fort Beaufort with them stuck on their mouths. They can't eat, they can't drink. And it's absolutely terrible. When you're walking in that felt, you have to have a good pair of pliers with you because for some reason they jump into the air behind you and go into the back of your leg. And what actually happens is they stick to your boot. And when you pick your foot up, you flip them up and they let go. And you're always getting blooming kaiki stuck in your boot. Luckily now there is a cochineal that works on kaiki, and so hopefully science will catch up with us. John, there's no kaiki in the Kamdebro, eh? Yeah, but proper kaiki. No, that's terrible. Um, and the question is, why is it still spreading? People aren't planting it, as John says. We've given up planting it. It's just still spreading because we are not killing it, and we're allowing seed to be carried around by birds, baboons, monkeys, warthogs, and obviously humans as well. And for instance, in 1891, by MacDonald was the in charge of the agronomy section of the country's Department of Agriculture. 457,000 hectares of the Karoo was overrun, classified as overrun. And a total of 565 was classified as infested. That's 500,000 hectares infested. And 457 overrun, where you couldn't actually farm anymore. You see, this is what I wish I could see that, because to me it's beyond, and the photographs that I see don't depict that. But I suppose in 1891 there weren't really many photographs. But in Graaff-Reinet, there was 92,000 hectares, but Janssenville had 105,000 hectares. 105,000 hectares. It was the most. Obviously, that's just the best place for prickly pear. Rainfall, temperature, or whatever. Okay, so there was lots of politics about the eradication. Leading farmers, such as Tom Murray of Graaff-Reinet, had planted 200 acres of spineless cactuses. However, he was pro-eradication, despite the potential cost to themselves. It was largely agitation from English-speaking farmers at the time, some of the sheep farmers around Graaff-Reinet, who helped place biological control on the political agenda. so there my Opa Grootjie was, despite the fact that he planted 200 acres of prickly pear, he was pro-eradication and he wanted to place back on the agenda. Collett's involved, Cranemere is mentioned, Thornton. So these are all old people from our time, from our term, okay? And technically the turning point was when the Department of Agriculture set up a station in Pretoria and one in Uitenhage. Okay. So they then started breeding and distributing cochineal and Cactoblastis insects. The Cactoblastis is a moth. Okay, so they release the moth. The moth lays the egg on the cladode. The egg actually looks like a thorn. They lay a whole lot of eggs in like a pod, and it looks like a thorn. And the impact of the insects was huge. They started dying, and we got control. Oh yeah, there was even Italian prisoners of war who had to chop the prickly pear out. I mean, can you imagine that? Eh? Imagine being a... Do you? Oh, it was amazing. Yeah. So yeah, the POWs complained like anything. Despite their Sicilian origins, they did not like the hard labor or the large spines of these plants. Especially towards the end of the fruiting season, they found themselves victims of fine glochids of the ripe fruit, because the fruit has got a much smaller little thorn, which is more dangerous. The POWs started to report sick in numbers. Okay. And yeah, they went on strike after 6 hours of work. They demanded hot food in camp at midday. Yeah, a lovely story. And the consequences of eradication. Like everything, some people got used to it. And there was a farmer in Willowmore who said that since he has had to camp his farm off, you can imagine he was probably a tractor at some stage. What is he going to do in times of drought? Because he can't move his stock. So he has to have prickly pear. And he was absolutely against eradication. And he went all the way to Parliament to go and fight the eradication program by the government. Can you imagine having a big fight about prickly pears? And obviously the Xhosa relationship with the prickly pear was a close relationship. They used it to fence their krale. They used it around their homesteads. They used it as food, and they used it to brew with. And those prickly pears that went into the Xhosa areas were carried all the way up into Zimbabwe by each clan. As they moved, they would take their prickly pears with them. Medicinally, there are some medicinal possibilities. They talk about the treatment of boils, but you know, these let's call them bossy doctors. They've always got something that they can heal with some plant, and I'm pretty certain prickly pears have got bossy doctor value. Yeah, it was scientifically evaluated as fruit, and Professor Zimmerman had a project to produce cochineal. In the 1990s, he came to Graaff-Reinet. He visited Kevin Watermeyer often because Kevin had a very easy, accessible, big plantation in good condition. And the whole idea was that Kevin might even have become a cochineal farmer. For some reason, it just never really got off the ground. And yeah, it became uneconomical. They tried in Ethiopia, and it was much more successful. So there are places where cochineal does get produced. Okay, so then they try to breed spineless varieties and better varieties and varieties that were not able to produce seed. And the interesting thing about that is that the biggest problem is these things crossbreed. And so even the spineless one that was brought in, the famous Burbank prickly pear, which was planted at Dalham as one of the very first plantations by Auntie Anne's grandfather, who was one of the pioneers of the Burbank introduction into South Africa. They produce fruit and they crossbred with the doornblad, and then they created a new kind, you know. And so there was this continuous mixing of genes and hybridizing. Okay, so getting to the end of the story, what I can suggest is if you really want to know a lot more, you can read about the book. Yeah, you can read the book. There are even ingredients for eating prickly pears. And in Mexico, the people eat them the leaves, okay? And this is called a nopal. Nopal is the word for a leaf. Okay, the fruit in Mexico is called a tuna, like a fish, literally, tuna. Probably pronounced a bit different than that. So this is one I prepared this morning for eating purposes. So you want this year's growth, the spring growth, which is fresh and nice. You pick it carefully, but it hasn't really got proper thorns on it. You pick it before it's got proper thorns on. Then you crop it, you know, like you scale a fish with a knife. It creates quite a bit of mucus. And then this is the edible part, okay? Here's one that hasn't been cropped yet, so that you can see, and now you can see what it looks like, okay? And there's one that's been cropped. I also trimmed it. I trimmed the edges off and the base off, and there they are there. And here are some that I cooked about 3 nights ago. And to me, they taste a bit like speckworm, sweet, sour, slimy. And then you cook them and you cook all the slime away. And then I added curry and cumin, and so I made like an achar. I don't know. I don't know if I'll do it again. For the amount of effort for what I got, you've got to be either very hungry or got to really need to have them. So yeah, I think that's just about it for now.
Been very interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed the Grafrikaans van Krap and the Doring and the Thorn and the everything. I think I heard more Grafrikaans today in half an hour than I've heard in 5 years. But it's been very interesting, Tim, and thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much.